The mining station Kepler 442b buzzed with the usual chaos of interstellar commerce. Cargo haulers from a dozen different species moved through the corridors, their translator devices chattering in overlapping conversations about ore prices and shipping schedules. But in the deepest level of the station, far below the bustling markets and docking bays, something else entirely was happening. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her medical kit as she followed the Zephyrian administrator down a dimly lit corridor. The blue-skinned alien's forearms gestured nervously as he spoke, his voice carrying the typical dismissive tone she had grown used to hearing from non-human species. The creature has been here for approximately 3 cycles, Administrator Vexilon explained. His primary arms crossed while his secondary ones fidgeted with a datapad. We found it stowed away in a cargo hold. Injured, but alive. The previous medics all refused to treat it. Sarah raised an eyebrow. In her 5 years working as a freelance medic in this sector, she had treated everything from crystalline beings to gas-based life forms. Very few creatures could shock her anymore. What species is it? Draconic. From the Outer Rim territories. Vexilon's tone carried clear distaste. They're known for their aggressive nature and territorial behavior. This one, however, is different. They descended another level via a freight elevator that groaned under its own weight. The air grew cooler and more stale. Sarah noticed the walls were reinforced here, meant for storage rather than habitation. Different how? You'll see, Vexilon replied cryptically. The corridor they emerged into was lined with storage units and holding cells typically used for dangerous cargo or troublesome passengers awaiting transport off-station. Most were empty, but at the far end Sarah could see one unit that clearly contained something large. As they approached, she heard it before she saw it. A low rumbling sound that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound so labored and painful. When Vexilon activated the viewing panel, Sarah had to suppress a gasp. The dragon was massive, easily 12 feet long even while curled up in the cramped space. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Its scales, instead of the typical deep emerald or crimson of most draconic species, were pure white, almost translucent in places, an albino. Even more striking was the pronounced curvature of its spine, creating a hunchback that forced the creature into an uncomfortable position. Heavy chains bound its limbs to anchor points in the cell walls. The metal had worn raw patches in its hide where it had struggled, and Sarah could see several untreated wounds festering along its flanks. "How long has it been chained like this?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Since its arrival. Standard protocol for potentially dangerous specimens." Vexilon seemed oblivious to her tone. The previous medics took one look and declared it too risky to treat. Something about draconic aggression being unpredictable. Sarah studied the creature more carefully. One of its eyes was swollen shut, and she could see what looked like burn marks along its neck. But what bothered her most was its posture. This wasn't the stance of an aggressive predator. The dragon was curled defensively, its head tucked low, every line of its body suggesting defeat rather than defiance. "Has anyone actually tried to communicate with it?" she asked. Vexilon's 4 eyes blinked in surprise. "Communicate? It's a draconic. They're barely sentient, mostly instinct and aggression." Sarah had heard that kind of talk before about various species, usually from administrators who had never bothered to learn anything beyond the most basic xenobiological classifications. She pulled out her portable scanner and began taking readings through the containment field. The results made her frown. According to this, it's severely malnourished and dehydrated. "When was it last fed?" "The automated systems provide basic sustenance every few days," Vexilon said with a shrug of his secondary arms. "Every few days?" Sarah's voice rose. "This creature needs daily nutrition, possibly more given its size and apparent injuries. It's fortunate we provide anything at all. Draconics are not protected under station welfare protocols." Sarah bit back her immediate response and focused on her readings. The creature's vital signs were weak but stable. What concerned her most was the obvious signs of long-term neglect. This wasn't just about recent injuries. This dragon had been suffering for a very long time. "I'll need access to the containment unit," she said finally. Vexilon's eye stalks recoiled. "Absolutely not. The risk assessment clearly states..." "The risk assessment was probably written by someone who's never treated a draconic in their life," Sarah interrupted. "Look at it. Does that look like a dangerous predator to you?" Appearances can be deceiving with their kind. Sarah pulled up her credentials on her tablet and showed them to the administrator. I have certifications in xenobiology from the Terran Medical Institute and 5 years of field experience treating non-human species. I'm telling you this creature needs immediate medical attention, and I can't provide that through a containment field. Vexilon studied her credentials with obvious reluctance. Sarah had learned that most alien administrators were impressed by official documentation, even if they didn't fully understand what it meant. Very well, he said finally, but I'll need to maintain a security presence. Fine, but they stay back and don't interfere with my work. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood before the containment unit with her medical kit, watching as 2 Zephyrian security guards activated the door controls. The heavy barrier slid aside with a pneumatic hiss, and immediately she was struck by the smell, infection, fear, and the musty scent of a creature that hadn't been properly cleaned in far too long. The dragon's head lifted slightly at the sound, and for the first time Sarah got a clear look at its eyes. Even through the pain and exhaustion, there was an intelligence there that stopped her in her tracks. This wasn't the mindless aggression Vexilon had described. This was fear, mixed with something that looked almost like hope. She took a slow step forward, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Easy there, she said softly, not sure if it could understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey her intentions. I'm here to help. The dragon watched her approach, its good eye tracking her every movement. Sarah noticed its breathing had changed, becoming more rapid. Whether from fear or anticipation, she couldn't tell. She knelt down just outside the range of the chains and began to unpack her medical supplies. I know you're hurt, she continued in the same gentle tone. And I know you're scared. But I'm going to do everything I can to make you feel better. Behind her, she heard Vexilon mutter something about typical human sentimentality. Sarah ignored him, focused entirely on the creature before her. She had a feeling this was going to be unlike any case she had ever handled. Sarah spent several minutes simply observing the dragon from her position, just outside its reach. Every medical instinct told her to move slowly, to let the creature acclimate to her presence before attempting any physical examination. The chains that bound its limbs were crude but effective, clearly designed more for restraint than the creature's well-being. How long do you plan to sit there? Vexilon asked impatiently from his position near the cell entrance. As long as it takes, Sarah replied without turning around. She had pulled out a small device that resembled a tablet, but was actually a translation matrix, capable of detecting and interpreting communication patterns from most known species. The readings were faint but definitely present. The dragon had been watching her with its one good eye, and Sarah noticed that its breathing had become less labored since she'd arrived. She began speaking again, keeping her voice low and steady. I'm going to run a scan now, she said, holding up her medical scanner so the dragon could see it. It won't hurt. Just tells me what's wrong so I can help fix it. She activated the device and a soft blue light played across the dragon's form. The creature tensed momentarily but didn't try to pull away. Sarah studied the readout, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. The injuries were extensive. 3 broken ribs, one of which had healed improperly. Multiple lacerations in various stages of infection. Severe malnutrition that had been ongoing for months, possibly years. What looked like burn scars that couldn't have been recent, and something else that made her pause. The spinal deformity, she murmured, adjusting the scanner's settings for a deeper analysis. It's not natural. What? Vexilon had moved closer, his curiosity apparently overriding his caution. Sarah looked up at him sharply. This hunchback. It's not a birth defect. Something broke its spine, probably when it was young, and it healed wrong, so? These creatures are prone to violence. It probably got into a territorial dispute. No. Sarah stood up, her voice carrying a conviction that made both guards step back slightly. Look at the pattern of the older scars. They're not from fights. They're from abuse. She turned back to the dragon who had been following their conversation with obvious interest. Sarah activated her translation matrix and spoke directly to the creature. Can you understand me? The dragon's response was immediate. A low rumble that the translation device interpreted as complex emotional content. Surprise, hope, and what could only be described as desperate gratitude. It's trying to say yes, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. It understands Vexilon's forearms crossed defensively. The device could be malfunctioning. Draconic communication is mostly instinctual growling. Sarah ignored him and addressed the dragon again. "What's your name?" This time the response was longer, a series of harmonious tones that the translator struggled to interpret. Finally, it produced a rough approximation. "Kethmore of the Dying Light clan." "Kethmore," Sarah repeated, and the dragon's eye brightened at hearing its name spoken correctly. "I'm Sarah. I'm here to help you." The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, limited by the translator's ability to interpret the nuances of draconic speech. But gradually a story emerged that made Sarah's heart ache. Kethmore had been born different. The albino coloring that made its scales beautiful also made it weak in the eyes of its clan. The spinal injury had occurred when it was barely more than a hatchling, the result of a strengthening ritual that had gone wrong. Or perhaps Sarah suspected it had gone exactly as intended. Cast out from its clan for being defective, Kethmore had spent years trying to survive on its own. The newer injuries had come from encounters with slavers, pirates, and others who saw a lone, disabled dragon as either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be captured. "How did you end up here?" Sarah asked. The translation was fragmented, but the gist was clear. Kethmore had been captured and was being transported to some kind of fighting arena when the ship had been raided. In the chaos, it had hidden in a cargo hold, hoping to escape when the ship reached its next destination. Instead, it had been discovered and turned over to station security as unregistered cargo. "And how long have you been in this cell?" The response made Sarah close her eyes in dismay. Not 3 cycles, as Vexilon had claimed, but closer to 8. 8 cycles of being chained in a cramped space, given minimal food and water, with no medical attention for injuries that had grown progressively worse. "This is intolerable," Sarah said, standing up and facing the administrator. "This creature has been essentially tortured for months." "It's a draconic," Vexilon replied with indifference. "They're resilient. It's a sentient being who's been systematically abused and neglected." Sarah's voice carried an edge that made the security guards shift uncomfortably. "I'm not leaving this cell until those chains come off and I can provide proper medical treatment." "Absolutely not. The safety protocols are based on outdated prejudices and ignorance." Sarah pulled out her tablet again, this time accessing her authority codes. "Under Galactic Medical Emergency Statute 7 Alpha, I'm declaring this an immediate health crisis requiring unrestricted access to the patient." Vexilon's eye stalks widened. The statute was real, though rarely invoked. It gave certified medical professionals broad authority in life-threatening situations, overriding local regulations. "You're taking personal responsibility for any incidents?" he asked. "I am." After considerable grumbling and what appeared to be consultation with higher authorities, Vexilon agreed to have the chains removed. Sarah insisted on doing it herself, wanting to make sure the process didn't cause additional injury. As each shackle came free, Kethmore flexed its limbs carefully, wincing at the movement but clearly relieved. When Sarah removed the last chain from around its neck, the dragon actually made a sound that the translator interpreted as gratitude. "Can you move?" Sarah asked. Kethmore shifted position slowly, testing its range of motion. The deformed spine made certain movements clearly painful, but it managed to lift its head and extend its wings partially. They were magnificent despite everything. Translucent white membranes shot through with delicate silver veining. "Beautiful," Sarah murmured, and was surprised to see what might have been a blush color the dragon's pale scales. She began her physical examination methodically, explaining each step to Kethmore before she did it. The dragon was remarkably patient, only flinching when she had to probe areas where infection had set in. "I'm going to need to clean these wounds," she said, producing antiseptic and bandaging materials from her kit. "It's going to hurt, but it's necessary." Kethmore's response, according to the translator, was essentially, "Do what you must." As Sarah worked, cleaning and treating the various injuries, she kept up a steady stream of conversation. She told Kethmore about her work, about the different species she had treated, about her homeworld. The dragon listened intently, occasionally responding with questions that showed surprising curiosity about human culture. "Why are you helping me?" Kethmore asked during a pause in the treatment. Sarah looked up from the wound she was bandaging. "Because you need help. That's what medics do. But I am draconic. Your kind and mine have not always been friendly. Sarah had heard about the territorial conflicts between human colonies and draconic clans in the Outer Rim, but looking at this injured, abandoned creature, she found it hard to understand how anyone could see Kethmore as a threat. You're not your species, she said simply. You're an individual who's been hurt and needs care. That's all that matters to me. The translation of Kethmore's response came through as something like profound emotional gratitude mixed with disbelief. Sarah realized that this might be the first time in years that anyone had treated the dragon with basic kindness. As she finished with the immediate wound care, Sarah made a mental inventory of everything Kethmore would need for a full recovery. Better nutrition, physical therapy for the muscle atrophy, possibly surgery to address some of the poorly healed injuries. It would take time, and she doubted Vexilon would be cooperative. But as she looked at Kethmore, seeing the first spark of hope in those ancient eyes, Sarah knew she wasn't going anywhere until this dragon was whole again. 3 days into Kethmore's treatment, Sarah had essentially moved into the lower levels of the station. She had convinced Vexilon to provide her with a small quarters adjacent to the storage area, claiming she needed to monitor her patient around the clock. What she didn't mention was that she had also quietly begun documenting everything for a formal complaint to the Galactic Health Authority. The transformation in Kethmore was already remarkable. With proper nutrition, regular cleaning of wounds, and basic physical therapy, the dragon had regained some strength and mobility. More importantly, the constant fear that had characterized its posture was beginning to fade. Sarah had brought down additional equipment from her ship, a portable medical scanner that could provide more detailed analysis, nutrition supplements specifically formulated for draconic physiology, and most importantly, a translation unit that could handle the subtleties of Kethmore's native language. The infection in your left wing is responding well to treatment, Sarah reported, as she checked the healing progress. But I'm concerned about the muscle deterioration from being chained so long. Kethmore flexed the wing carefully, testing its range of motion. It feels stronger than it has in many cycles. But flight, I have not flown since before my capture. We'll work up to it gradually, Sarah assured him. She had learned that Kethmore preferred masculine pronouns, though the concept of gender seemed more fluid in draconic culture than in most humanoid species. As she worked, Sarah had been learning more about draconic society, and what she discovered disturbed her. The treatment Kethmore had received from his own kind was not unusual. Draconics with any form of disability or difference were often cast out or worse. The albino coloring that made Kethmore striking to human eyes was considered a curse mark among his people. Your scales are beautiful, Sarah said as she applied a healing salve to a particularly stubborn wound. The way they catch the light is incredible. Kethmore's neck flushed with that same pinkish tinge she had noticed before. Among my kind, they are a mark of shame, a sign that the ancestors have turned their backs on my bloodline. Your kind might be wrong about a lot of things, Sarah replied firmly. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy boots, multiple sets. Sarah looked up to see Vexilon approaching with what appeared to be a delegation of station officials. Dr. Chen, Vexilon announced formally. The station council has some concerns about your extended treatment protocol. Sarah stood slowly, positioning herself between the officials and Kethmore. She had been expecting this. What kind of concerns? A Krillian delegate with purple-tinted carapace stepped forward. Sarah recognized him as Counselor Vexkrin, one of the station's senior administrators. The extended use of a detention cell for medical treatment is irregular. Additionally, the resources being expended on a single non-citizen are becoming significant. Non-citizen? Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge. Kethmore is a sentient being who was illegally detained without proper medical care. The fact that he doesn't hold citizenship on this station doesn't make him less deserving of treatment. Nevertheless, Vexkrin continued, the council has voted to terminate this arrangement. The creature will be transferred to a more appropriate facility. Sarah felt Kethmore tense behind her. Through their developing bond, she could sense his fear spiking. What kind of facility? There is a research station in the Proxima sector that studies exotic species, Vexilon explained with false cheerfulness. They have expressed interest in acquiring a albino draconic for their behavioral studies. The translation was immediate and chilling. What they were describing wasn't a medical facility. It was essentially a laboratory where Kethmore would become a permanent test subject. Sarah had heard of such places. The creatures that went in rarely came out in any condition that could be called living. Absolutely not, Sarah said flatly. I won't allow it. Dr. Chen, Vexkrin's tone took on a patronizing quality. I understand your humanitarian instincts, but you have no authority to prevent this transfer. The creature is station property acquired as unclaimed cargo. Station property? Sarah's voice rose. He's a sentient being, not cargo. Behind her, Kethmore spoke for the first time since the delegation had arrived. His words came through the translator with perfect clarity. I formally request asylum under the protection of Dr. Sarah Chen and the Terran Federation Medical Corps. The effect was immediate. Every alien in the delegation stepped back in surprise. Asylum requests were rare but legally binding under interstellar law, especially when made by sentient beings facing potential harm. Vexkrin recovered first. Draconics do not qualify for asylum protections. They are classified as aggressive species with limited sentience. That classification is based on outdated xenobiological assessments, Sarah countered. I have 3 days of documented evidence of complex communication, emotional depth, and advanced reasoning capabilities. Any tribunal would accept Kethmore as fully sentient. You cannot prove. I can prove that he has been systematically abused while in station custody, Sarah interrupted, pulling out her tablet. I've documented every injury, every sign of neglect, every violation of basic medical ethics. I can also prove that he's capable of complex thought, artistic expression, and sophisticated communication. She turned to Kethmore. Tell them about the song you were composing yesterday. Kethmore's response came through the translator as a complex musical phrase, something about starlight on water and the sound of wind through crystal formations. Even rendered in mechanical translation, it was clearly poetry. Draconics do not create art, Vexilon stated, but he sounded less certain than before. This one does, Sarah replied, which means your classification system is wrong, and any attempt to transfer him to a research facility constitutes trafficking of a sentient being. The legal implications were clear to everyone present. If Kethmore was recognized as fully sentient, then his treatment constituted a series of serious crimes. The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I'm prepared to sponsor his asylum request personally. As a certified member of the Terran Medical Corps, I have the authority to provide protection for patients under my care. Vexkrin's mandibles clicked irritably. The paperwork alone would take weeks to process. Then I suggest you start immediately, Sarah said sweetly. Until the asylum hearing is complete, Kethmore remains under my medical protection. After the delegation left, muttering among themselves about human stubbornness and legal complications, Sarah turned back to Kethmore. The dragon was watching her with an expression she was learning to recognize as gratitude mixed with amazement. You would truly risk your standing for me? He asked. My standing doesn't mean anything if I can't use it to help someone who needs it, Sarah replied, settling back down to continue her examination. As she worked, Kethmore began to hum, a low, harmonic sound that seemed to resonate in the walls themselves. Sarah realized it was the song he had been working on, the one he had mentioned to the delegation. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything she had ever heard. What's it about? She asked. Hope, Kethmore replied simply. I had forgotten the feeling until you arrived. Sarah had to blink back tears as she continued her work. She had treated hundreds of patients over the years, but never had she felt such a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about healing physical wounds anymore. It was about proving that compassion could bridge any gap, that intelligence and dignity existed in forms that the galaxy's bureaucrats had never bothered to recognize. As evening approached, Sarah made her final notes in Kethmore's medical file. Tomorrow she would begin the more complex treatments. The surgery needed to reset his improperly healed ribs, the physical therapy to rebuild his flight muscles. It would be challenging work, but for the first time since she had become a medic, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Rest well, she told Kethmore as she prepared to return to her quarters. Sarah, he called softly, using her name in his own language, which the translator rendered as something like Lightbringer. Thank you for seeing me as more than my scars. As Sarah walked back to her quarters, She carried those words with her like a warm light in the darkness. The surgery to reset Kethmore's ribs was scheduled for the 5th day of treatment. Sarah had managed to secure a proper medical bay on the station's 3rd level, much to Vexilon's displeasure. The procedure would be delicate. Draconic physiology was complex, and Kethmore's years of malnutrition had made his bones more fragile than they should have been. "Are you certain this is necessary?" Kethmore asked as Sarah prepared the surgical equipment. His nervousness was evident in the way his tail twitched and his good wing kept folding and unfolding. "The ribs healed incorrectly," Sarah explained, showing him the detailed scans on her medical display. "They're putting pressure on your lung tissue and restricting your breathing. If we don't fix this, you'll never be able to fly properly. And if something goes wrong during the surgery?" Sarah paused in her preparations. It was a fair question. Draconic anatomy was well documented in medical texts, but she had never actually operated on one before. The risk was real. "I've consulted with 3 specialists via quantum comm," she said finally. "Dr. Yelthera from the Centauri Medical Institute, Dr. James Morrison from Earth General, and Professor Kixtel from the Vegan Academy. They've all reviewed your scans and agreed on the procedure." What she didn't mention was that 2 of them had initially advised against the surgery, citing the risks of operating on a malnourished patient with such extensive prior trauma. It had taken Sarah hours of arguing to convince them that Kethmore deserved the chance at a full recovery. "You have operated on many species," Kethmore observed, "but never one of my kind." "No," Sarah admitted, "but I've never let that stop me from helping someone who needed it." Kethmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended one clawed hand toward her. "I trust you, Sarah of the Terran Federation Medical Corps." The formal way he said her title made Sarah realize he had been researching human medical traditions. Among Draconics, she had learned, entrusting one's life to another was a sacred bond not entered into lightly. The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah worked with meticulous care, guided by real-time consultations with her off-world colleagues and monitored by the station's automated medical systems. Kethmore's physiology proved to be more resilient than expected, but also more complex. His bone structure was not just denser than human bones, but actually had a crystalline component that made cutting and reshaping them particularly challenging. Halfway through the procedure, Sarah encountered a complication she hadn't anticipated. One of the incorrectly healed ribs had fused partially with Kethmore's spine, creating a bony growth that was putting pressure on his spinal cord. This explained some of the chronic pain he had described, but it also meant the surgery was far more dangerous than they had originally planned. "Dr. Chen," came the voice of Dr. Morrison through the comm system. "I'm seeing the same thing on my readouts. That fusion is integral to his current spinal stability. Removing it could cause paralysis. But leaving it means he'll be in constant pain and never regain full mobility," Sarah replied, her hand steady despite the gravity of the decision. "The risk-benefit analysis doesn't support—" "Dr. Morrison," Sarah interrupted, "what would you do if this were a human patient?" There was a pause. "If it were a human patient with the same level of determination and will to recover that I've seen in your documentation, I'd probably take the risk." Sarah looked down at Kethmore's unconscious form. Even under anesthesia, she could see the tension in his features that spoke of years of chronic pain. She thought about their conversations, about his dreams of flying again, about the hope she had seen growing in his eyes over the past few days. "Talk me through it," she said. The next 2 hours were the most challenging of Sarah's medical career. With Dr. Morrison and Professor Kixtel providing guidance, she carefully separated the fused bone from the spinal column, working with instruments designed for much smaller operations. Every movement had to be precise. One slip could sever the nerve pathways that controlled Kethmore's wing function. When it was finally over, Sarah's hands were shaking from exhaustion and tension. The surgery had been successful, but they wouldn't know the full extent of that success until Kethmore woke up and they could test his range of motion. "Excellent work." "Dr. Chen?" Dr. Morrison's voice came through the comm. "I've never seen anyone handle a spinal fusion separation that cleanly on their first attempt with an unfamiliar species." "I had good teachers," Sarah replied, carefully monitoring Kethmore's vital signs as he began to emerge from anesthesia. When Kethmore's eyes finally opened, the first thing he did was try to move his wings. Sarah held her breath as she watched the translucent membranes extend fully for the first time since she had met him. The left wing, which had been permanently folded due to the rib damage, stretched to its full impressive span. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked. Kethmore was quiet for a moment, testing the movements carefully. Then his expression transformed into something Sarah had never seen before, pure joy. "I feel whole," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "The pain that has been my constant companion for so many cycles, it is gone." Over the following days, as Kethmore recovered from the surgery, Sarah began to see glimpses of who he had been before his life became defined by suffering. He was curious about everything, asking endless questions about human culture, about the other species Sarah had encountered, about the wider galaxy beyond the mining station. He also revealed talents that had been suppressed by years of pain and captivity. The song compositions she had heard hints of before blossomed into complex musical pieces that seemed to tell stories of starlight and ancient draconic legends. He created art from the most mundane materials, turning discarded medical supplies into intricate sculptures that captured light in impossible ways. "Where did you learn to do this?" Sarah asked, watching him weave strips of bandage material into a pattern that somehow resembled a nebula. "All draconics create," Kethmore explained. "It is part of our nature, like breathing or flying. But among my clan, my creations were seen as wrong, too different. They said the albino curse had touched my mind as well as my body." "Your clan were idiots," Sarah said bluntly, and was delighted to hear Kethmore's rumbling laughter in response. "You have a way of saying things that cuts through complexity," he observed. As his physical recovery progressed, Sarah began working with Kethmore on flight preparation. His wing muscles were severely atrophied from disuse, and retraining them would be a gradual process. They started with simple exercises, building up to basic gliding motions. The first time Kethmore managed to lift himself off the ground, even for just a few seconds, Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face. For a being whose people were born to fly, those moments of weightlessness represented far more than physical recovery. "I had forgotten," Kethmore said softly after landing. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be free." But their progress was not unnoticed. Sarah had become aware that they were being watched, not just by station security but by others. The asylum request had attracted attention from various groups, some supportive, others decidedly hostile. Representatives from draconic clans had begun arriving on the station, and their intentions were unclear. "There are complications coming," Kethmore warned her one evening. "I can smell them on the air. My kind do not approve of what you have done." "What I've done is provide medical care to someone who needed it," Sarah replied firmly. "You have done much more than that," Kethmore said, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that the translator couldn't quite capture. "You have given hope to those who were meant to live without it. That is a dangerous gift, Sarah Lightbringer." As if to underscore his words, Sarah's comm unit chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender was identified as clan speaker Morthak of the Iron Scale clan. The message was brief and formal. "The aberrant one you harbor belongs to us. Surrender him or face the consequences." Sarah looked at the message, then at Kethmore, who had gone very still. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. "That," Kethmore replied with grim humor, "may be precisely what they have in mind." The delegation from the Iron Scale clan arrived 2 days later with all the pomp and intimidation they could muster. Sarah watched from the observation deck as their ship docked, a massive vessel that looked more like a weapon than a transport, its hull decorated with battle scars and what appeared to be trophies from defeated enemies. Clan speaker Morthak himself was everything Sarah had expected from his message: imposing, traditional, and radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from a lifetime of never being questioned. His scales were deep emerald with gold edging, marking him as high-ranking among his people. The other draconics who accompanied him were similarly impressive and equally intimidating. "You will surrender the aberrant one immediately," Morthak announced without preamble when he met with Sarah and the station council. His voice was a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in the walls themselves. "Kethmore has requested asylum," Sarah replied calmly. "He's under the protection of the Terran Federation Medical Corps." Morthak's head swiveled to focus on her with predatory intensity. "You dare to speak its name as if it were a true person? The thing you harbor is marked by the ancestors' displeasure. It has no right to clan protection, let alone the protection of aliens. The thing I harbor, Sarah said, her voice gaining an edge, is an intelligent, creative, sentient being who has been systematically abused by his own kind. If that's what clan protection looks like, I'm glad he's seeking it elsewhere. The clan delegation reacted with what could only be described as outrage. Several of the younger Draconics moved forward aggressively, only to be stopped by a gesture from Morthak. "You do not understand our ways, human," the clan speaker said with condescending patience. "The aberrant one is cursed. Its very existence is an insult to our ancestors and a pollution of our bloodlines. We seek only to correct a mistake that should have been addressed at its hatching." Sarah felt ice-cold fury building in her chest. "Are you saying you would have killed him as a child?" "It would have been a mercy," Morthak replied without a trace of shame. "Dr. Chen," Vexilon interjected nervously, "perhaps we should consider the clan's position. They do have traditional rights." "They have no rights over Kethmore," Sarah interrupted. "He was cast out, abandoned, and left to survive on his own. You can't claim someone as property after throwing them away." But Morthak wasn't finished. "The aberrant one has been spreading poison wherever it goes. We have reports of other clan outcasts gathering, speaking of hope and dignity. This cannot be allowed to continue." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. It wasn't just about Kethmore anymore. Word of his recovery, of his treatment with dignity and respect, was spreading among other Draconics who had been cast out by their clans. The idea that someone like them could be valued, could be seen as more than their disabilities or differences, was apparently threatening to the entire traditional power structure. "Good," Sarah said finally. "I hope it spreads like wildfire." Morthak's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You will return our property or we will take it by force." "Over my dead body," Sarah replied, unconsciously echoing her words from the previous evening. "That can be arranged," Morthak said with silky menace. The standoff was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the chamber's entrance. "If you wish to claim me, clan speaker Morthak of the Iron Scale, I am here." Kethmore stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 station security guards who looked profoundly uncomfortable. His recovery had been remarkable. The surgery had not only healed his physical injuries but seemed to have unlocked a confidence that had been buried under years of pain and abuse. He stood straight despite his spinal curvature, his wings held proudly, his albino scales catching the chamber's light like captured starlight. The effect on the clan delegation was immediate and profound. Several of them actually stepped backward, and Sarah heard what sounded like whispered prayers or protective chants. "Abomination," Morthak breathed, but Sarah caught something else in his voice. "Fear." "I am Kethmore of the Dying Light clan," Kethmore said formally, using the full ceremonial cadence of draconic speech. "Cast out by my birth clan for the crime of being different, survivor of your hunts and your purges. I stand before you now, not as your property, but as a free being under the protection of those who see worth where you see only shame." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued with devastating precision. "I have been healed by the skill and compassion of Dr. Sarah Chen. I have been treated with honor and respect by humans while my own kind left me to die in chains. I formally renounce any claim the Iron Scale clan or any other draconic faction may have on my person or my life." The formal renunciation was apparently a significant ritual in draconic culture. Sarah watched as the delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not having expected this level of formal resistance. "You cannot renounce what was never granted," Morthak snarled. "Aberrants have no standing to make such declarations." "Perhaps not under draconic law," came a new voice from behind them. Sarah turned to see a figure she recognized from news broadcasts, Ambassador Teledine of the Galactic Mediation Council, a cerulean diplomat known for her expertise in interspecies law. "Ambassador," Vexilon stammered, clearly caught off guard by her arrival. "We weren't expecting—" "The asylum request filed by Dr. Chen triggered an automatic review by my office," Teledine explained smoothly. "I've been monitoring the situation with great interest." She turned to address Morthak directly. "Clan speaker, I've reviewed the documentation provided by Dr. Chen regarding the treatment of this individual. If even half of what's documented here is accurate, the Iron Scale clan could face serious sanctions under the Galactic Protection of Sentience Act. The aberrant is not protected under galactic law, Morthak protested. On the contrary, Teledine replied, producing a data pad. The evidence of sentience provided by Dr. Chen is more than sufficient to establish full personhood protections. The artistic works, the complex communication patterns, the sophisticated emotional responses. Any tribunal would recognize this individual as fully sentient. She turned to Kethmore. More importantly, the formal renunciation you just made is recognized under galactic law. You are now officially a free individual, not subject to the laws or customs of your birth species. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Morthak looked like he was considering physical violence, but the presence of the ambassador complicated things significantly. Attacking a protected individual in front of a Galactic Council representative would have severe diplomatic consequences. This is not over, he said finally, his voice carrying a promise of future conflict. Yes, it is, Sarah replied firmly. Kethmore is under permanent medical protection. Any attempt to harm him will be considered an attack on the Terran Federation Medical Corps. As the clan delegation filed out, their hostility was palpable. Sarah knew this was far from over, but for now, Kethmore was safe. Thank you, Kethmore said softly once they were alone. Don't thank me yet, Sarah replied, watching the clan ship depart through the observation window. Something tells me the real fight is just beginning. But when she looked at Kethmore, standing proud and unafraid, his scales gleaming with health, his wings no longer hidden in shame, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Let them come, Kethmore said, apparently reading her thoughts. I am no longer the broken thing they cast aside. I am Kethmore the Restored, friend of humans, and I will not hide in darkness again. Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, compassion could change the galaxy. The attack came 3 weeks later, not in the form Sarah had expected, but as something far more insidious. It started with a simple medical emergency alert. Dr. Chen, we have incoming casualties, Vexlon announced over the station's communication system. A draconic transport ship has suffered life support failure. Multiple critical injuries. Sarah was in the middle of a physical therapy session with Kethmore when the alert came through. His flight muscles had strengthened dramatically, and he could now sustain short flights around the modified cargo bay they had converted into a practice space. Go, Kethmore urged when Sarah hesitated. You are a healer. It is what you do. But as Sarah hurried to the medical bay, something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, coming just after several more aberrant draconics had arrived on the station, seeking the same treatment and protection that Kethmore had received. The casualties were real enough. 5 draconics with severe respiratory distress and what appeared to be radiation poisoning. But as Sarah worked to stabilize them, she began to notice inconsistencies. Their injuries were too uniform, too precisely calibrated to require specific treatments that would keep her occupied for hours. It was Kethmore who figured it out first. Sarah, his voice came through her comm unit with urgent alarm. The others are gone. What others? Veltar, Nixmoth, and Silena. The 3 who arrived seeking sanctuary. Their quarters are empty and there are signs of struggle. Sarah's blood ran cold. While she had been distracted treating the convenient casualties, someone had abducted the other draconic outcasts. The medical emergency had been a diversion. Security to the medical bay. She called out, but even as she said it, she knew it was too late. By the time station security could organize a search, the kidnappers would be long gone. Dr. Chen, came Ambassador Teledine's voice over her personal comm. I need to speak with you immediately. There have been developments. Sarah left the medical bay in the hands of the station's automated systems and hurried to the diplomatic quarters. She found Teledine in intense conversation with what appeared to be a holographic projection of someone from the Galactic Council. The situation has escalated beyond what we anticipated, Teledine explained grimly. The draconic clans have filed a formal complaint with the Council, claiming that you are harboring stolen property and inciting rebellion among their populations. Stolen property? Sarah's voice rose in indignation. They're claiming that the outcasts are not truly sentient, but rather diseased or mentally defective members of their species who are not capable of making decisions for themselves. The council representative explained. They want all draconic aberrants returned for what they call proper treatment. Sarah felt sick. She had a pretty good idea what proper treatment would involve. What's worse, Teledine continued, is that they've provided what they claim is medical evidence supporting their position. Brain scans, genetic analyses, behavioral studies, all suggesting that draconics with physical abnormalities also suffer from cognitive impairments that make them legally incompetent. That's impossible, Sarah protested. I've documented extensive evidence of Kethmore's intelligence and creativity. Evidence that they claim was fabricated or misinterpreted, the council representative said. They're demanding an independent medical evaluation by neutral specialists. Sarah realized with growing horror what was happening. This wasn't just about Kethmore anymore. Word of his recovery and transformation had indeed spread among draconic outcasts across the galaxy. Just as Morthak had feared, hundreds, possibly thousands of draconics who had been cast out or abandoned by their clans were beginning to seek help, to demand recognition of their worth. The traditional clan structure couldn't tolerate such a challenge to their fundamental beliefs about genetic purity and worthiness. They were launching a systematic campaign to reclaim their outcasts and silence the movement before it could spread further. The three who were taken, Sarah said urgently. Where are they? Unknown, Teledine replied. The clan ship departed the system before we could investigate. But I suspect they'll surface soon as evidence in the clan's case, probably in whatever condition supports their argument about cognitive impairment. The implications were chilling. The clans would torture or drug the captured outcasts until they appeared to be the mentally deficient creatures the clans claimed they were. There has to be something we can do, Sarah said. There is. Kethmore's voice came from the doorway. He had arrived quietly and had apparently been listening to the conversation. But you will not like it. Sarah turned to face him. What do you mean? The clans are using their traditional laws and customs to justify their actions, Kethmore explained. Under draconic law, disputed ownership can be settled through formal combat. If I were to challenge Morthak directly and win, it would establish not only my own freedom but create a legal precedent for other outcasts. Absolutely not, Sarah said immediately. You're still recovering. You've barely been flying for a week. And Morthak is a trained warrior with centuries of combat experience, Teledine added. It would be suicide, but Kethmore's expression was resolute. It may be our only option. The longer this drags through official channels, the more of my kin will suffer. There has to be another way, Sarah insisted. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked frantically to find alternatives. She contacted every ally she could think of, medical colleagues, legal experts, sympathetic officials in various governments. But the response was always the same. This was a complex interspecies legal matter that would take months or years to resolve through proper channels. Meanwhile, reports began coming in of other draconic outcasts being retrieved by clan representatives across the galaxy. The movement that had begun with hope was turning into a nightmare of systematic oppression. It was Dr. Morrison who provided the breakthrough. Sarah? His voice came through, the quantum calm with barely contained excitement. I think I've found something. You know those brain scans the clans provided as evidence of cognitive impairment? Yes? I've been analyzing them and they're not showing cognitive impairment at all. They're showing something else entirely. Evidence of deliberate neural suppression. Sarah felt her heart racing. What do you mean? The patterns are consistent with the effects of a specific neural toxin, one that temporarily suppresses higher cognitive functions. These draconics aren't naturally impaired. They've been drugged. The revelation was stunning. The clans hadn't just been abandoning their outcasts. They had been actively poisoning them to make them appear mentally deficient, then using that apparent impairment to justify their treatment. Can you prove it? Sarah asked. With the right tests, absolutely. The toxin leaves distinctive markers that persist for months. Sarah looked at Kethmore, who had been following the conversation intently. We need to test you, she said. If we can prove that the clans have been systematically poisoning their outcasts, it changes everything. Do it, Kethmore said without hesitation. As Sarah prepared the neural scan equipment, she felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. If they could prove that the clans had been deliberately impairing their outcasts, it would not only free Kethmore and the others but expose a conspiracy of abuse that stretched across draconic society. "This is going to change everything," she murmured as the scanners hummed to life. "Yes," Kethmore agreed, his voice carrying a mixture of anticipation and grim satisfaction. "It is."